Hello, and you are listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco Justice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Tongva people and all of their relatives in a place we call Los Angeles. Welcome, I am Jack Ite. On today's show, Revolutionary Icons, the Power of Black Madonnas and Folk Saints. Los Angeles art critic Shana Dambrot and African-American visual artist Mark Steven Greenfield discuss his latest exhibition called Auras, featuring his Black Madonna and Halo series of paintings and texts recorded by LA Art Documents. I will read from some of those texts as well as feature the Yoruba DUNDUN Talking drum ensemble and an excerpt from a PBS show featuring Greenfield called Craft in America. Mark Steven Greenfield is an African-American visual artist from Los Angeles. His work deals primarily with the Black experience and in recent years has focused on the effects of stereotypes on U.S. culture, stimulated much-needed and long overdue dialogue on the issues of race. He's been exhibited extensively throughout the United States as well as internationally. He has served on multiple arts and community boards, as well as received a long list of awards, accolades, and residencies over the years. Mark Steven Greenfield's work concerns itself with the complexities of the African-American experience, historic and contemporary, Black stereotypes, spiritual meditative practices, social justice, and abstractions of subconscious imagery. Recently, he's produced 2 series of paintings and texts, Halo and Black Madonna, in an exhibition called Auras. Halo comprises portraits of influential Black figures, from the revered to the lesser known, telling stories associated with Black saints, folk saints, and pseudo-saints, and a few scoundrels of the African diaspora, portrayed as saintly icons surrounded by gold leaf. The curator of the show, Mika M. Cho, wrote, "By appropriating and repositioning socio-political religious signs and symbols, Halo colonizes the colonizer." Black Madonna depicts a beatific ebony Madonna and child, while Ku Klux Klan members and monuments to white supremacy are vanquished and toppled in the background. Sacred and secular realms collide, juxtaposing mass culture objects with holy symbols and sites. The Black Madonna phenomena may be seen as Christian assimilations of pagan goddesses from regions inhabited by people of color to assist the church in converting them. Yet Greenfield reinscribes the Black Madonnas within contemporary African-American culture, or his own fantasies of racial justice confronting centuries of white supremacy and enslavement. Beyond retribution, reparations, and one-dimensional racial categorizing, as Michaela de la Cosmorman wrote, Greenfield's Black Madonnas allow viewers to glimpse the transcendental divinity within every Black face. It's not easy to do a radio show on art that demands to be experienced firsthand, but Greenfield gives us another way to engage with his work through the written stories that accompany each of his figures painted with acrylic and framed in gold leaf on wood panels. So I will endeavor to share a few of these stories to properly set the stage. First one to catch my attention was Gullah Jack. First, because of my interest in the Gullah Geechee culture of the South Carolina coast, and the word conjurer in orange, as mirrored backwards, Jack Pritchard, known as Gullah Jack, born in Angola in the 18th century, captured and taken to the island of Zanzibar in 1805, sold to Zephaniah Kingsley, transported to eastern Florida, then sold to a shipbuilder in Charleston, South Carolina. He was described as a conjurer or a performer of evocation. He could summon spirits and supernatural agents that caused people in the African American community to treat him with respect. His leadership role in the Methodist Church and as an African priest, his understanding of numerous African dialects gave him greater influence. He met Denmark Vesey, a wealthy former slave, also with influence in the community, who approached him with plans for a general slave rebellion in 1821, convincing him to act as a recruiter. Jack used his spiritual powers to formulate initiation rituals for recruits. They planned to, poison Charleston's water supply, seize weapons at the state armory, take control of the city, commandeer ships in the harbor, and set sail for Haiti. However, they were betrayed by the authorities. They evaded arrest for 3 weeks, but eventually were captured and sentenced to death along with 34 other conspirators. Denying his guilt, Gullah Jack was hanged on July 12, 1822. The Denmark Vesey Rebellion is considered the largest slave conspiracy in North American history. On that note, let's jump into the discussion between Mark Steven Greenfield and friend of the show, Los Angeles art critic Shana Dambrot. She did an interview earlier in 2024 that you should definitely look up on our podcast list or website, Mark Steven Greenfield's show at the Ronald H. Silverman Fine Art Gallery. It was displayed on the campus of Cal State Los Angeles. Premiered in October, and the video was presented on the YouTube account of LA Art Documents.
I have known you for 1,000 years, far too long. We're both way too young to have been friends as long as we've been friends. And if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you are maybe the artist of all the artists that I know, who's the best at explaining yourself and what you're up to and being clear. You are one of the most intentional creators that I know. And so I, Shana Dambrot, art critic in Los Angeles, and for those who don't know, am not, no. I just meant, oh my God, what if there's somebody here who's like, who's that girl? And so I just want to say a couple of things, and then I think I, as well as everyone here, just really wants to hear from you, because there's so many things going on in this show. So I think a great place to start would be for you to just describe for everyone a little bit of that arc, like how it started and how it's going with this series, please. And I'll jump in if I want to pull on the thread, but I really just want to hear from you, don't worry.
The series was more or less propelled by when I first heard that they were banning books. When I grew up, one of the things about books was that they were sacred. And I used to read this comic book. It was called Classics Illustrated. Some of you may remember that. And what it did was it kind of whet your appetite for reading the book itself. And so I was really introduced to the classics by that. And in our household, books were something that were sacred because they held a lot of information. And when I heard that they were talking about banning books, I thought it was one of the most disturbing things that I had heard in recent memory. And I realized that even though you can ban a book, it's a lot more difficult to ban an image. And so people that were hell-bent on kind of rewriting our history, it became important to me to make sure that that history would last. So you can burn the book or do whatever you want to do, but once you see the image, that image is in your head, and the story that's associated with that image gets into your head too.
Yeah.
I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I fell as soon as I reached the age of reason. But the thing about it, I went to Catholic school. I was an altar boy. I learned the Mass in Latin and all the rest of that stuff. And, we had Carmelite friars and we had Sisters of St. Joseph and the whole thing.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And, the thing about it was that as much as I rebelled against the dogma, I really appreciated the ceremony and the ritual.
The aesthetic.
The aesthetics of it were just beautiful, and, Sunday you'd sit up there and you'd do a high mass and you'd be getting high on the incense and, every so often you'd take a couple swigs of the altar wine and, it was pretty good.
Yeah, lots of velvet, candelabras and whatnot, yeah. No, and the architecture. And to your point, I mean, obviously it's a callback to what Classics Illustrated did for you, right? Start with the image, whet the appetite for the rest of the history. But it's also a callback to like why Catholic churches look the way they do, why the stained glass windows, why the paintings, because we're talking about a time when Mass was read in Latin. Mm-hmm. So even if you were literate as a sort of lay person in the congregation, it probably wasn't in Latin. So there was a barrier. And there was not a lot of teaching everyone to read going on in the Middle Ages, for example. Mm-hmm. And so that partly helped sustain the authority of the priest as the only intermediary if you wanted to talk to God, because you couldn't even read you had to believe what he said the word was. That I grew up in secular New York Jew, so everything I know about Roman Catholicism I know from the Renaissance sections of my art history education, but that's a lot because this stuff existed in order to convey the message to would-be believers in the total absence of them being able to read whatever text existed. Mm-hmm. And so for better or worse, that was also the strategy of that aesthetic that you responded to. So that makes sense like in a second parallel way. Yeah. So
the first iteration of the series actually was the Black Madonnas.
Yes.
And the Black Madonnas were disturbing to a lot of people because you're not supposed to take these images and portray them any other way other than how they were classically exposed. And so I was looking at the Madonnas by Da Vinci and by Bellini and Raphael and all those people. And, it just struck me going back to an earlier conversation I had when I first got out of undergraduate. And I would take my work around to different galleries, and the gallerists would say, "We like your work, but it's so ethnic." Which I understood was code for black, which, the subcode for that was not marketable. And, the argument that I was having with them basically was I just got finished with 4 years of schooling. And I sat up there and studied all these artists, and never once did their ethnicity really enter into what I was.
Well, it was assumed.
I'm sorry?
It was assumed.
Yeah,
right.
It was just assumed.
It was inherent, implicit, assumed. But what's so interesting is that this is also like those things are starting to be teased apart in more detail now in other aspects. There's an entire discourse about Beethoven. There's I'm not likening it to Bridgerton as like a pop culture joke, but just to say what made that possible is actual scholarship on the personal ancestry of Queen Anne. Like that wasn't cut up. I mean, the rest of it, we're not here to talk about, but just to say that was the foundation for that is people now looking back and going, oh, wait, not to mention the fact that everyone in the Bible was North African, definitionally, there are no white people in the Bible. I'm so sorry, And that's just something that's become more able to be discussed and more readily available as knowledge in the world at the same time as the Black Madonnas and everything that came after it coming out. So did you feel like you were a lone voice in that way, or did you feel like you could see other artists and musicians and historians and whatever?
I was wrestling with this contradiction because when I was in my earlier years, I lived in Europe, and we would go to a lot of churches throughout France and throughout Germany and stuff like that. And you would see the Madonna characterized in all kinds of different ways. And, one of the more intriguing was whenever you saw a Black Madonna.
Which did exist, by the way.
They 500 of them in France.
That's what I'm saying. So in the course of this, you also have brought to light a true historical fact that needs to be known, that's not really taught in art history, etc.
So years later, I had maintained some relationship with a few Catholics, a couple priests and stuff like that. And I asked him, it's like, what's this deal with the Black Madonna? And, he was really hard pressed to come up with a solid answer. And the church does not have an answer for why there is a Black Madonna. What they have said on many occasions was that because of all the soot that the candles threw up. It settled on these
Oh,
Madonnas,
girl, that's
and
not
they turned
better.
black.
That's
okay?
not better.
It sounds good, but I
No,
said,
it doesn't. It
okay.
sounds horrible.
You know, if you want to go down that road, what about St. Joseph? He didn't turn black.
No.
What about these other saints that you got there? St. Agatha didn't turn black. So what's that all about? You know, and he could not explain it.
Yeah.
And later on, years later, I'm talking to somebody else that's, you know, a theologian, and they were saying that the Catholic Church oftentimes uses the Black Madonna as a dumping ground for all the things about its dogma that it does not want to explain. So it's like, okay, that'll hold me for now. You know?
Well, I mean, it's horrible, but this is going to sound weird, but like that kind of tracks. Like that, it's horrifying, but it makes sense more so than, like these 500 times there was a bad candle around.
No, I was very, very
it's
fortunate.
worse, but not. But
as the universe works, I was very fortunate to make the acquaintance of a woman who actually wrote in the catalog. Her name is Michaela Mormon, and she is a scholar, and she did her graduate thesis on the Black Madonna.
Excellent.
And she has torn it apart in ways that I hadn't even thought of before. And I was so happy and so lucky, actually, to have run into her. And her essay in the catalog is really quite excellent. You know, you'll get a feeling for it.
And that's kind of what I meant. Like, you kind of like, you did this despite all the pushback. Mm-hmm. And then it turned out there's a community of other people who have noticed this themselves and are doing it in their own
So when
way.
I'm in Brazil and you go into churches in Brazil, oftentimes you run into the Black Madonna. There, it was a calculated practice because what they wanted to do was make sure that the Madonna looked like everybody else in the neighborhood. You know, and what it reminded me of was when I was a child in China, and we'd see pictures of the Madonna, and she'd have slant eyes. Okay, and it was to make sure that everybody realized that here's a Madonna that looks like them, that they can relate to, that's from their culture.
Which was a strategy that was part and parcel of erasing the pre-existing indigenous
parts of
cult,
South America, they've colored the Madonna.
With,
you know, parts of Africa, they've colored the Madonna.
That's why a lot of holidays kind of suddenly fall around, you know, like why in the world would a Catholic Saints Day happen to fall on the solstice? So I don't know. Well, they were already planning. Yeah. So that kind of appropriation-based erasure was a very common strategy, obviously, throughout colonialism. And it's interesting, though, because to me, that's like consciousness of guilt. Like they knew what they were doing. And do you know what I mean? Like the narrative is sort of like is told from the European point of view, obviously is not true facts stated truthfully. But it's very interesting to me that there were to know that there were people on the ground in that moment, that it wasn't only just about sort of like appropriating this or that, but that they were willing to completely change the core archetypal visual dogma of their own religion under whose banner they were flying as the communication strategy once they got. Like that to me is something I'm going to have to, that just has I'm caught on that now because the specificity of that so many centuries ago is really dark. Okay. So you're discovering all this, but you're already painting them.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you abandon your religious belief, let's say, it creates a vacuum. And so I was searching for something to fill that vacuum. And I was looking at all kinds of other religions. Not that I had gotten that deep into practicing them, but
there's all the Yoruba paintings, the paintings you made with the Egwe, am I saying that right?
Igun. Igun, that goes back to Brazil.
That's Brazil. But I'm just saying all this stuff
I did not get into candomblé.
No, but I don't know. But you spend enough time paying attention to it that a whole series of really meaningful, beautiful work came out of it.
I have a healthy respect for other religions.
Yeah.
You know, I believe that everybody finds their path on their own. What happened with me was I got into meditation. And the meditation kind of filled that void. And I realized all the possibilities that existed through that. When I was looking at some of these classical pictures of paintings of the Madonna and stuff like that, one of the things that always intrigued me was what was going on in the background. Because there's always be little stuff going on in the background, okay? little stuff that's kind of enigmatic. You can't quite interpret what it's all about, but it's there. And you know it's there for a reason. And the artist had an intent for putting it there.
Yeah.
So I decided to flip the script. I'm sitting up there doing these Black Madonnas, but in the background, I put images of white supremacists that are being persecuted, okay, in many of the same ways that African Americans were over the course of years. And so it's kind of this revenge fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, in many ways. But the thing that you have to understand is that you're contrasting this image of mother and child, this unconditional love, with these other things that are in the background, okay? And usually, you know, your existence is somewhere in the middle of all of that, okay? Because we all have those good and bad sides of ourselves.
That's so interesting to think of it as the sort of self and shadow self moving around in the composition, because obviously the revenge fantasy aspect, which is pretty satisfying emotionally, I mean, obviously, and also frequently kind of funny, which is like a little unexpected reprieve. But also the hypocrisy of how much death and violence was perpetrated in the name of the church this whole time, and religion generally. So that's also there. But to be able to look at them and now think of them as all contained within one sense of oneself, and to be figuring it out, that is fascinating.
So these tantos that you see that exist in all of these, besides being...
These shapes.
Yeah, besides being a mechanism for tying all of them together, actually do represent a visualization of my mantra, okay? So,
oh, wow, oh my God.
You know, in the mantra, they explain to you that you start off repeating the mantra, and then a thought will come into your head. So what you see in terms of the circles represent the thought about that particular person and their history and stuff like that. And then you slowly go back into the mantra. And each time you do that, you go into deeper and deeper levels of consciousness. And so, you know, to a large degree, that consciousness that you achieve as a result of that meditative practice informs how you approach these subjects.
And where in the choice of subject does that happen? Like, do you think, okay, this is the figure or the episode from history or the thing ripped from today's headlines that I want to make my next work or a work about, and then sort of meditate on it and then go back and forth? Or is it more holistic? Like you meditate and see what comes and then that's the work you do. You don't have to fully pull the whole thing apart, but I'm just curious like how it, you know, what that conversation's like in your studio with yourself.
Well, a lot of times, you know, I'm fascinated with these little known figures from the African diaspora. People that you don't know. I mean, everybody's heard about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and stuff like that. And we can do images of that forever. But some of these people, in their own way, were very heroic, and their ability to overcome their situation was something that I felt could serve as an example for everyone.
I agree. And I think that's an important point, is that as much as there is and I love that you called them revenge fantasies, I don't know why that makes me so happy, but that they're not entire fantasies. I mean, in other words, you know, when you go to put the composition together, that may be a place of invention, but it's if it's fiction, it's historical fiction. And the figures themselves are not fictional at all. I mean...
Well, the figures in the Halo series, no.
Right.
They all existed.
They all existed.
Yeah.
And so they're not a sort of type of thing that might have happened. They're not composites of the kinds of stories. It's a figure with a life that you've researched and documented. And so to your point of the Classics Illustrated, it's like, you're going to see the image, you've seen the image, it's in your brain. But if you would also like to learn, it's written down, it's right here. That's who the person is. That's what the state is. That's what this word means.
You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to Revolutionary Icons, the Power of Black Madonnas and Folk Saints. I'm your host, Jack Ide, and we feature Los Angeles art critic Shana Dambrot and African-American visual artist Mark Steven Greenfield discussing his Auras exhibition recorded by LA Art Documents. Another striking painting from the Halo series is Carlotta of Cuba, cradling an AK-47 in her arms in a relaxed pose before a fort. Carlotta of Cuba is also known as Carlotta Lukumi. Was born free in the Kingdom of Benin, West Africa, a descendant of the Yoruba people of present-day Nigeria. Carla was kidnapped, taken to Matanzas, Cuba, around age 10, and became a slave on the Triunviratos sugar plantation. Although Haiti did away with slavery in 1803 in Latin America and the British empires were following with abolishing it, Cuba continued the practice with brutal Spaniard plantation owners. In 1843, Carlotta and another enslaved woman named Fermina began to plot a general slave rebellion. Fermina was caught distributing plans among the neighboring plantations and was beaten and imprisoned. Carlotta then employed music as coded conversation to spread the plans with talking drums. That November 1843, she and other tribal leaders initiated the Triunvirato rebellion. They freed the prisoners, burned down the house where people had been tortured, and then destroyed 5 other plantations, killing any white person they came across. The uprising sparked an international response from the U.S. military. Armed with only machetes and farm tools, the rebels were no match for a professional army, as many were massacred at the San Rafael estate. Carlotta was captured, tied to 4 horses, until her limbs dislocated, drawn, and her body quartered. She remains a symbol of resistance in Cuba.
And so I would imagine it's a field of research that the more you dive in, the more you realize there is still to find, ever expanding. How do you make choices?
I tell people constantly that the research is ongoing. And what happens is it kind of creates this chain of reference. Like, for instance, if you'll notice, there are probably a half a dozen figures in the Halo series that are from Haiti. And Haiti has always been a fascinating situation because it's one of the places in the Western Hemisphere that I feel that has been punished for the successful slave revolution and continues to be punished to this day. Every other island in the Caribbean has some sort of tourist situation going on.
And now we're coming after even the people who fled.
Now we're coming about the
that
people
we
that
supposedly
came here.
welcomed.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, that's what I meant when we were talking a little bit earlier. I was like, so Mark, how does it feel to be making paintings this whole time and it's still in the headlines today? Right? I mean, so that's a whole other subject of like, how's it going? But just to say like, well spotted vis-a-vis Haiti, because if anyone has any doubt that you're right about the punishment dynamic that we still enact toward them, turn the news on.
Yeah. A lot of them are from the Caribbean, a lot from Brazil. I spent some time, I was in a residency in Brazil for a number of months.
When I met you, you were on your way to the Amazon.
Oh, that was another trip.
I know that was a different trip, Val, I see somewhere, but nevertheless, literally the day I first met you in life, right. I was like, so what are you, whatever, we were working on some kind of cola thing. And I was like, oh, well, let me get something in a couple of weeks. And you're like, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be canoeing down the Amazon, actually. So maybe when I get back from that. So that was my first impression of you, is you're on your way to like Fitzcarraldo, yeah. It was impressive. But just to say, like, yes, you've been there a lot.
We swam with the piranha.
So you're not scared of anything.
No.
That's right. But, so this is also like, I think that's an important thing is, you also have made a point, and this is something we've talked about before. A lot of artists go on residencies. Residencies are great. We love residencies. But you keep picking these places where not only has horrific happened in the past, but then like while you're there, there'll be a riot. Like you were in Charlotte?
I was in Charlottesville.
You were in Charlottesville.
I called my mother up and I said, yeah, they're rioting down the street. She said, well, make sure you don't put your butt in the middle of all of that. And the next night, they were on my doorstep.
He's like, oh, I have this balcony. It's so nice in the evenings. What? Like, okay, right. So that's what I mean. So research is research, but we're not only talking about like you at the library. Like you get on planes, you put yourself physically in the place, in the mix when you're doing this research. You go to the place. And how, I mean, aside from, I mean, in some ways the answer is obvious. How important does that vary? But I guess I would ask, like, in what ways it's important to you to not only acquire the information, but to experience the location to as great a degree as you can while you're working on them.
You know, it's really interesting because one of the pieces over there, Maria de Oliveira, I was on this island where all this took place and didn't find out about it until I got back here.
Wow. Right,
You know?
because this
and the
is all
thing
over
about
the
it was,
world.
on a lot of levels, she existed almost at the point of legend. There hadn't been a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that she even existed. But the story had been passed down and passed down and passed down. 3 weeks before this show opened,
This show that we're in
now, I got a correspondence from a Brazilianist who said that one of her colleagues had gone to Lisbon and gone through their archives and actually found records of her. And the story, I mean, I love the story.
Like, have a great opening, Mark. Like, it's like a little card to you from her. Like, I know you've been looking for me. I want you to have a great show. I mean, that's incredible. Wow.
So the story behind her, which
Please
one
tell
of my
it.
favorite
Because we
stories.
can't tell everyone that, and I do want you to tell some. So please, she's a great one.
Like, I can't keep track of those things.
Please, yeah.
But she was a revolutionary in Itaparica, across the bay from Salvador.
Okay.
And the Portuguese were getting ready to set up shop in Salvador. And they floated in with like an armada of something like 40 boats or something like that. She gets together with her girls and she says, we can take care of this.
I love that it's girls.
And they seduced the men off the boats, or seduced the guards off the boats, middle of the night, got them drunk, got their clothes off.
So easy.
And then started beating them with this bush called cadansal, which is like poison ivy, but it's a lot stronger. And if it breaks the skin, you get an infection. And the infection can kill you, okay? And so while these guys are writhing in agony, it gave enough time for the resistance to swim out and burn down all their boats.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Icon. That's icon. I mean, that's incredible. I'm so sorry to whoever thinks it's weird. I love that so much, but I do. So no, I mean, that story, okay. And here's just like another, you said this a little while ago, right? Like, these stories are one kind of story, but they're actually stories that belong to all humanity. Mm-hmm. Like, do you need proof that we've been through something like this before, that our ancestors have figured out, have figured out ways to push back, like that there are heroes in the past that we can look to, that, the degree to which legends are so often based on real people, that's literally the point, is that they are real people like you, which means you are not powerless either. Not that anyone is suggesting like literally doing that per se, but your version of that, something. Put yourself a little bit at risk, get your girls together. Don't just be afraid and let it happen. And that is a lesson that I think, I don't know, might have some resonance for today.
So the other part of this, that I'd like to explain too, is that what I consider these contemporary icons on a lot of levels. Okay?
Well, that's the thing. There's not just Madonnas. Like, anyone who knows art history or the church knows there's hundreds of these saints, and they all get that same treatment.
But remember what icons were used for back in the day. An icon was usually carried in front of the army, and it was a not so subtle way of telling your opposition, God is on our side. And my belief was that we're confronted with a lot of challenges these days, and we need a whole new set of icons for a whole new set of problems.
And I personally am a little over being told by people who want to take my rights away that it's because God said.
Yeah.
For example, that's just me. We're not here to, but right. I mean, in other words, there's a little bit of resonance for our current situation and women in that situation. So, and not just in America and not just in the West. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of like another version of the same question. I would love to hear, everyone kind of loves her, right? The red bodycon dress with the pipe and the obvious, like, couldn't care less queen energy. I mean, there's a reason people are drawn to that one. but also that's one of the rare ones without events going on in the background.
True.
Right? And
Yeah.
so, there are, like I was saying before, like there are choices that get made along the way. And like this one, for example, the landscape, to my mind, sort of references more of that like generic background, like behind the Mona Lisa, it's rocks and waterfalls, and there's kind of like a standard version of that they all kind of did, or that was like a thing. You fill it in, you solve your color problems, but there's nothing really going on back there. Whereas in much of the work that you sourced from, there are things going on back there. You talked about that. So when you go to illustrate, so you've got the person, and you kind of know what that needs to be, a kind of version of that same portrait. Like, Saint Sebastian is always, you can tell which one it is because the arrows. There's one, like they perform their martyrdom in their physical description, in their saint images, right? So that part, you solve that. They have a story, you figure out how to illustrate it in their figure. But now it's time to put things in the background. And that is where some of the more impactful ones are definitely contemporary events going on in the background, or let's just say not necessarily contemporaneous with the figure. You reach across different periods of history. So when you go to make those decisions, is that like, how do you sort of decide what is going to be the action behind them?
I run a lot of tapes in my head about what would happen if I tweaked it just this much, or put some element of humor into it, because I know humor sometimes can draw the viewer in and really make the message a lot more impactful.
They'll spend longer with it too.
As you're talking, I'm looking over your shoulder at Carlotta of Cuba, okay, which is a woman from the 1600s who's carrying an AK-47.
For example.
Where's the sense of that,
Right.
She was a revolutionary in Cuba. In the 1970s, Cuba sent 5,000 troops to Angola in an operation called Operation Carlotta.
I did not
and
know
it was
that.
to help to liberate Angola from the Portuguese.
Wow.
And so that's why I decided to characterize her with a modern weapon. And the castle that's in the back is in Matanzas in Cuba, and that castle actually exists. So there are things like that. There's a piece over in this room, I think, of Stephen Bishop, and he was instrumental in mapping the Mammoth Caves in Kentucky. Okay, and nobody's ever been able to map the entire cave system in Mammoth. The cave system is supposed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 438 miles of cave. It's the largest cave system in the world. And he was actually enslaved by the guy who bought the caves for $5,000. And he was responsible for the whole tour program that was set up for the caves. He did realize his freedom a few years before he died. But I chose to characterize him carrying a canteen with the bat symbol on it as the original Batman.
A kind of dark avenger, by the way, as well, happens to be.
So, sometimes I'll sneak certain things in that suggest a little bit about the person or how I even feel about the person. I decided to put halos around everyone's head because it goes back again to that whole idea of Catholicism. And one of the things that struck me about Catholicism was how arbitrary it was on the part of the church to designate somebody to be beatified, okay? And oftentimes
miracles.
It's like, you get a support group and they say, oh, we need to make a saint out of this guy. Well, that didn't work too well in the case of Junipero Serra, right? No. When they found out that he was cutting off the hands of Native Americans.
Yeah.
Realizing that it was that way, well, what if I decided I wanted to make people saints? Realizing that everybody has both that good and that bad side. Realizing that there's the positive and negative of everyone. They're just people. And at some point in their life, they did something that impacted other people in a heroic way. And I chose to make sure that their memory is not forgotten.
Yeah. No, and there's a saying, there's two versions of the saying, right? In the Jewish vernacular, when someone dies, it's like, may their memory be for a blessing. But there's another one, may their memory be for a revolution. And that's the thing. And I think it's beautiful that you took the language of the elevation to sainthood, because not only does it allow you to stay within this incredibly appealing vernacular and, visual lexicon, but also because the concept of the hero has been so militarized and or comic bookified in our culture that I think like there's no way that a version of this in like superhero gear, or not that you considered that, but like if you went down the hero visual language, we have shorthand for that that's very like movies and pop culture. And I think, and or war, or like, propaganda TV shows, whatever, like that's hero in the popular visual language of America, at least. And so I think bringing it to something with roots outside of the contemporary cultural vernacular, I think was a really great strategy, because everybody knows that this is a Catholic altarpiece, right? If you've been to a museum, you know that that's what this is. You don't have to have anything to ever do with Christianity in any form to know what the reference here is. And so right away, it's like everyone's on the same page. We know what gold leaf is. That's why Andy Warhol's Gold Marilyn was gold, because his whole point with that is we've elevated our pop culture celebrities to the status that used to be reserved for religious icons and aspirational sainthood. And so I'm going to use the one thing we know church has, which is gold leaf, right?
Do you know why these are gold?
I always thought it was because of that. Oh, there's more. I love you so much. Tell me.
It gets a little deeper.
Okay. Settle in.
I mean, besides the fact that, gold was what was normally used for these icons, one of the things
and
about
the richness
gold,
of the church.
And the riches of the church. One of the things that struck me was it was also the currency by which most of these people were, the business these people were transacted, the slave business. And so that was a very deliberate decision that I made in terms of using that.
Oh my God, I need to sit with that for a second. I think everybody needs to sit with that for just a second. Well, I also point out that I told you were intentional, and you're like, oh, not mean. I'm just an artist. But the thoughtfulness, the insane thoughtfulness of that, and the sort of emotional whiplash of how gorgeous and seductive it is, with like reminding you that this was the money actually, is. See, I've been friends with you for 20 years, and I literally just learned that fact about this work with everyone. And some of you might have known, Val knew. But like, wow. Okay, and so now you have completely come back off the work into my emotional space and complexified and kind of dubbed my relationship to something that I was, no, not me, but me, the viewer. Like, by the way, you're not going to get off the hook just enjoying this. It's beautiful. But I've got something for you behind that beauty, which is such an unforgettable, powerful kind of gesture on your part, and also rebounds and makes us think about every bit of topicality inside the images in a different way as well. I mean, in other words, that's an incredibly successful material. Your material has meaning kind of moment in the work. Wow. Yay, thank you. I didn't know that. I thought I knew a lot about this work, but I didn't know that. And damn.
You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and SoCal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today, you're listening to Revolutionary Icons, the Power of Black Madonnas and Folk Saints. I'm your host, Jack Ide, and we feature Los Angeles art critic Shana Dambrot and African-American visual artist Mark Steven Greenfield discussing his Auras exhibition recorded by LA Art Documents. Letitia Munson is depicted as an elder woman smoking a pipe with a coat hanger on her arm, angels' wings, and of course, the gold halo encircled in floral designs. Also known as Letitia Leaney, she was born into slavery on a North Carolina plantation in 1820. Her master had her trained into the healing arts, and she spent 5 years studying practical medicine and herbal remedies with doctors and Native Americans. In 1861, she gained her freedom and settled in Ontario, Canada, with her husband and 2 children. By the end of the 1860s, she was known as a healer, fortune teller, and confidant of women with unwanted pregnancies. She would often advise them to have their children in the U.S., taking advantage of poorhouses where they could give birth anonymously. She had a small house where she would board pregnant women. Ellen Weingardner, a local hotel worker, had come to Munson in 1878 for delivery of her daughter. In 1882, Weingardner again spent the night in Munson's boarding house. She was later found dead there, a victim of a late-term abortion. Munson's home was searched, and she was implicated. At her trial, her lawyer argued Weingardner died of a self-inflicted abortion, an assertion supported somewhat by the autopsy. An all-white, all-male jury found her not guilty, but the press was unrelenting that she did it. The scandal made her a social outcast, and no more is known about her.
Going back to what I was trying to explain in terms of like the positives and negatives,
Yeah.
like, and how everybody has that, I'm thinking in terms of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who a lot of people don't realize that after Toussaint was captured, Toussaint Louverture, and taken to France and ultimately died, that Dessalines took over the Haitian Revolution. And one of his first orders of business was to kill 5,000 men, women, and children that were all French.
Oh.
His idea is, I have to purge this island of the French. And so on the one hand, you look at that atrocity, but on the other hand, you look at the fact that in many respects, he's considered the father of the country.
Well, right. I mean, both. I mean, that's not an either or. Like, the point is
that duality.
That duality was like people know about epigenetic trauma now. And so to think that is the origin story, the idea, especially psychologically, if you deal with collective subconscious and all that stuff, to know that is the circumstances of the birth of the modern nation explains a lot.
And even before...
No matter what you think about it, it explains a lot.
Before Dessalines, there was a guy named Francois Mackendal in Haiti. And he had lost his arm in a sugar press when he was, I think, 10 or 12. But he became an herbalist. And even though he was enslaved, people would go to him for healing. But he also knew how to make poisons.
I bet he did.
And he distributed poisons to every plantation that he could. Okay, and he's responsible for killing.
I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible, but honestly, first of all, just start with the fact that, don't gloss over the fact that we're talking about 12-year-olds running sugar presses. Mm-hmm. Like, that was, you know what I mean? Like, that's just like low down on the level of crimes against.
But let me continue with this story.
Yeah.
So he's basically, somebody tattled on him, and he was captured. Okay, and he kept saying, you can't hold me. And he escaped several times and was recaptured. So at the point where he was getting ready to poison the water supply, he was captured again. And this time they said, we just got to burn this guy. We're tired of him. So they assembled all the slaves in the town square. I think the crowd was like 2,000 or 3,000. And they tied him to the stake to burn him. But because of the fact that they couldn't get a secure tie because he was missing an arm, when they set the fire alight, he jumped off the fire, okay? And made the statement, it's like, you can't kill me, I'm bad, okay? So then they cleared the square, and they tied him to the stake again. This time they set him on fire. But because nobody saw it, the legend existed.
Because they cleared the square.
Because they cleared the square. So the legend is that his spirit still roams that island, and that his spirit was actually the one that inspired Toussaint Louverture to the revolution.
I mean, that doesn't sound like a legend to me. That sounds like what happened. Do you know what I mean? Like, in other words, the spirit does still roam the island. Hello. Whether is it a ghost? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But is the spirit still roaming the island? Obviously. Right? I mean, that's how, because it lives in the culture and the whispers and that's incredible. And that, by the way, so that's one painting. That's one painting.
I'm not going to can't go through all of it.
So just to say, I'm so glad that there's starting to be books and more books, because that's what's required, right? Because the ultimate goal is education of more people of how things actually were.
I'm looking over your other shoulder now. The mariner that's there, a guy named...
the one with the ships behind his...
Lope Martin.
Yeah.
Lope Martin was reputed to have actually studied navigation. He was enslaved in Morocco and taken to Spain. And when they found out that he had navigational skills, they sent him to Mexico. Because both King Philip and the Pope wanted to find a new route to get to the Indies, of course. So they sent 3 boats out. He, of course, got the boat of all of them. But there was an Augustine monk that was on another boat. And in the middle of the Pacific, they hit a storm and got separated.
Oh.
Lope actually made it to the Philippines. They made it too, but in a different place. After he had kind of solidified his beachhead in this one island, he went out to try to find the other ships. And they sailed around for 2 months trying to find them, and they could not. So he turns around and goes back to Mexico. And he gets back to Mexico, and like he's hailed as this hero. But the viceroy there is like, well, wait a minute, we don't know if we want this black guy to get all this credit, because we were really counting on the Augustine monk taking all the juice from this thing. The Augustine monk and his other 2 boats come in a couple months later. And then they said to Lope, they said, you need to go back because we need better charts on how to get back to the Philippines. And it said, and by the way, when you get to the Philippines, give this letter to the magistrate. Oh. And the letter was sealed.
I don't like
And somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, Lope said, you know what?
Yeah.
I want to see what's in this letter.
Yeah, I do too.
He opened the letter up and it says, when you see this guy, kill him.
Yeah.
And he never came back.
Yeah. Right.
And he had established so many relationships across the Pacific that he didn't have to come back.
He didn't have to come back. And he had this boat already.
Yeah, exactly.
And, thanks for the boat,
exactly.
Everyone. Yeah.
But, he's considered the Christopher Columbus of the Pacific.
For better and worse.
Yeah.
Right. In both. Right. I mean, what I love about it is the fact, how, it's easy to just sort of say, oh, history is not, binary, this or that. This happened, no, this happened. Okay, we're done here. Because as you keep saying, every actor in history is a person with 2 sides to themselves. So, a minute ago, you had us being like, yeah, jump out of that fire. The whole water supply, you know what I mean? And so, right? And so it's kind of like everything is a degree and nothing is just one thing. And to my mind, that's like a completely ideal place for art to be. Because as I never tire of saying, one of art's superpowers is the ability to contain paradox in itself. You can create a reality in an image that in no way, shape, or form could exist in front, not just in front of you, but like you can bend time streams, you can play with a better informed versions of race and gender. You can do whatever, economies of space mean nothing. What structural architecture doesn't need to be structurally sound. I mean, you can do whatever you need to do in an image to make sure everything gets in there, even the things that contradict each other. Mm-hmm. And that they can exist simultaneously in a painting in a way that maybe they couldn't exist in the world, but certainly people even have trouble cognating paradox. And so to be able to kind of create a fixed image that contains so many different things within it simultaneously and so many layers, I think is A, incredible, and you're gifted an artist, but B, like that is what art at its finest, I think, is for, kind of, is what you're doing with it. And so that's why I'm obsessed with you.
But it's really interesting because, in my academic life, when I was teaching, one of the things that struck me was that concept becomes much more important now than your ability to communicate things literally.
Or at all, or whatever.
And so on a lot of levels, my work is criticized as being too didactic. But at the same time,
ironically, it does so with extensive
I have
reading
actually
materials.
embraced that whole idea.
No, I'm teasing. You're absolutely right. And I think, there's a reason that, that the Renaissance was like successful messaging, right? And it's that skill set is kind of, your version of that. And I think it's kind of annoying that they were right because of all of the bullshit. But here we are. I mean, it's, at least in the Western tradition, it's sort of unmatched for powers of communication. So, and also culpability in the specifics of the narratives you're picking. And so I think that's there's like such a beautiful shape to that.
There is the story of Califia that Mark Steven Greenfield features. It came from the year 1510. Califia is the mythical black warrior queen and inspiring character in Garcia Rodriguez Montalvo's 16th century epic poem, Las Selgas, or The Adventures of Esplandian. Queen Califia rules on the fabled island of California, a utopia brimming with pearls and gold and inhabited only by her menacing army of black Amazon women. Commanding a naval fleet and an aerial flock of 500 winged griffins, the pagan queen is a fierce adversary for the Crusaders, but is eventually conquered, converted to Christianity, and married off to a chivalrous Spaniard. She returns to California, that island of black Amazon women, with her husband to establish a new Christian dynasty and new adventures. Spanish explorers, commanded by Hernan Cortez, learned of an island off the coast of western Mexico inhabited by, well, I guess they were saying there were some black Amazon women living out there. So, of course, they emulated Montalvo's story and named it California. The island, of course, turned out to be a peninsula that we know today as Baja California.
The focus of my art actually changes according to my mood. Sometimes I do art for art's sake, and it's kind of therapeutic when I do abstraction. It allows me to go gestural, to basically go improv, go into a lot of different spaces. But, I always seem to come back to something that's figurative, that's something that's kind of narrative. This is an enslaved man in Philadelphia. His name was Moses Williams. And his parents were actually set free earlier on, but for some strange reason, there was a law in Philadelphia that said he couldn't be set free until he was 27. So his master at the time was a guy named William Phelps, I think it was, and he taught him how to do these silhouette drawings. And he became known for doing, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 of them. Arguably, he was the first African American to receive any recognition as an artist in the United States. This is an example of the Black Madonnas. I did a series of 18 of these. They're based on traditional portraits of Madonna and Child by Bellini, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael. And what I've done is kind of change the context of them. What you'll notice from top to bottom are actually these tantos, these kind of graphic forms that are characterizations of my mantra. I've been involved in meditative practice for the last 40 years. And I had always been looking for some way to communicate the idea of a mantra graphically. So I pretty much settled on this. And you'll notice it's a through line through both the Black Madonna series and the Halo series. This is a guy named Henry Box Brown. He was a slave actually in Virginia. And what he did was actually put himself in a crate and mailed himself to Philadelphia. It took him something like 6 days to get from Virginia to Philadelphia, and he almost died in the course of it. After he got out, he became a magician. Wasn't really well received in the United States, but went to Europe and was able to tell his story and do magic there and became quite successful. This is Marie Joseph d'Angelique. She was an enslaved person in Montreal, Canada. She was mistreated constantly by her master. And she kept threatening her master, said, "I'm gonna burn your house down, I'm gonna burn your house down." In 1764, there was a fire in Montreal. Most of all of old Montreal burned down. So they blamed it on her. They made her hold a torch in front of the parish church. And then once the torch went out, they hung her. And it was about 3 weeks later they found out that she really wasn't responsible. This is a woman named Margaret Garner. She was the person that Toni Morrison based the story Beloved on. She had 3 children, and she actually had escaped slavery, but because of the fugitive slave law, she was basically cornered. And as opposed to giving her children up, she actually killed her daughter. It's one of the saddest stories I've come across. She was tried, but she was actually set free because she was considered property. So she had to actually live with the fact that she had killed her daughter. She ultimately died of, I think, tuberculosis. There are stories to be told, and I want to be in a position to tell those stories and find effective ways to do that. And if those stories in some way impact people's lives, I've done my job. I've accomplished something.
Thank you to the artist Mark Steven Greenfield, art critic Shana Dambrot, LA Art Documents, Craft in America from PBS, and the Yoruba DUNDUN Talking Drum Ensemble. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Revolutionary Icons, the Power of Black Madonnas and Folk Saints. For an extended version of this show, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer and host, myself, Jack Ite, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.